and the North Koreans, and they're all of them irreconcilable. The first is, and I think it should be made more of, North Korea is a slave state. I mean, its whole population is owned and made to work day and night on a slave plantation by a crime family headed by Kim Jong-il. And the consequences of that slavery are that the average height of a North Korean is now 6 inches less than that of a South Korean. It's because, as well as being a slave state, where the people are the private property of the ruler, it's also a famine state, where the slaves are not even fed. They're starved as well as being enslaved. And that isn't just a moral question, though I think it should be a very urgent moral one. It's a political and military question because the means by which that slavery is maintained and that malnutrition and famine is maintained is by nuclear blackmail. The North Koreans regularly up the stakes on nuclear tests and missile tests so that we will pay the bill for food that they can't meet on their own dime. So this is a humiliating exploitation of us by them based on blackmail. And I think they may now finally have overplayed their hand, as Milosevic did, as Saddam Hussein did, as other mad dictatorial and theocratic regimes have done. They've made it harder to think of continuing to collaborate with them than it would be to think about removing them and disarming them by force. They've reached that point now,
yeah.
And I think that's where the point of balance of the argument should now be.
And is that practical? I mean, are there means to remove him without knocking out half the population?
It would be a simple matter to disarm North Korea and to demolish at least a good bit of its regime. That would be an afternoon's work for the U.S. Air Force, a fairly easy afternoon's work. It's a tiny, impoverished, ridiculous. There's not even a state, let alone a country. It's just the bit of Korea that's owned by the Kim Jong-il crime family. The difficulty is that with its conventional weapons, it could take revenge on large population centers in South Korea without using nukes. It would just with its existing rockets. And we've so far been responsive to that blackmail. But that blackmail also gets worse as time goes by. They'll be in a position a few years from now to do far worse damage than this. So the real question is, if there's going to be a fight, should it be now or later? Should it be on our terms or theirs? Should we pick the time, the principle, and the place, or should we let them get to the point where they could make all those same suggestions, but to us, backed by force? And these are, of course, intolerable conditions, but they're the same conditions we've had to meet before from previous tyrants who've overreached their strength.
A fascinating debate to watch from up here that's going on in the United States, and in particular with speeches by Barack Obama and Dick Cheney last week, is the torture debate. A lot of people argue they're both wrong, and as a man who's been waterboarded, I guess you might have a unique perspective on this.
Well, never mind the waterboarding for now. Thank you for reminding people, though. I'm thinking now of the photographs that I'm fairly sure are going to be published of sexual abuse and other recreations in Abu Ghraib, which weren't even designed, I should remind your listeners, to elicit information. I mean, this was just a sort of sadomasochistic rodeo that was being allowed to take place in a prison that we ran in Iraq. I mean, the shame is unbelievable, and if half of what I've heard is true about these photographs, they constitute a sort of moral Chernobyl, and it won't even be possible for people like Vice President Cheney and the quite respectable people who I at least admire for their courage in supporting him. It won't be possible to argue that this was being done in order to get information. It was being done because it could be done, and the disgrace is nearly absolute.
Now, I know you are, as we might say, of no party or clique, so you don't speak for conservatives or Republicans or the left or the right, but I'm curious, again, about your perspective on what's going on with the Republicans in the United States. They seem to be in a complete state of meltdown. Do you think this is transitional or transformational or cyclical?
I would say if it ends in AL at all, it's suicidal. I'm not a Republican, so I don't really know what it feels like to be a member of the GOP, but it's impossible to imagine what must be going through their minds as they behave in the way that they do. They seem determined, not like Barry Goldwater after 1964, to go into opposition as a principled conservative party, willing to endure some time in the wilderness so that their principles will once again be refreshed and made relevant again. Nothing like that I can see, because what is the principle? No one's been able to tell me. Instead, it's becoming a sort of rancorous minority based on the politics of resentment, and with no visible talent anywhere near the top of its leadership. A dying elephant is a horrible thing to have to watch.
My guest is journalist Christopher Hitchens, who will be speaking in Toronto next week. The Republicans are always saying, or what's left of them anyway, that they need to find the next Reagan. And of course, you wrote a famous essay about Ronald Reagan, which I was rereading this afternoon, in which you said he was dumb as a stump, and you called him a phony and a loon. Why do you think Reagan continues to be elevated to such heights?
Well, because although I did say and do believe those things about him and worse, he did manage to get himself on the right side of history in probably two ways. Or history came round to vindicate him. Let's not argue about which it was. But he was right in thinking that communism could be defeated, not just contained. That it would, or rather that it would collapse and pass away. He was correct in that sort of highly euphoric, as we used to think, an optimistic view. And he was right that Keynesianism, the New Deal form of Keynesianism, would hit diminishing returns. That people would get bored with the welfare and subsidy and big spending state, which for a considerable time he was right about that too. Of course, we're now in a period where all of that seems very questionable. But Reagan's achievement in the long and medium term, I can't take away from him, even though I don't forget all the terrible things he said and did.
Thank you very much. Pleasure as always.
Pleasure mine. Thanks for having me.